At 67 years old, after 4 decades working as a seamstress out of my house in Southside Atlanta, I never thought I'd hear my daughter-in-law Tasha celebrate my absence from my son Ethan's wedding, as if my presence were a curse she had finally dodged. That Saturday morning, I woke up before sunrise, just as I had done every day since my husband Curtis passed away 15 years ago. I carefully pressed my best navy blue dress, the one I had bought specifically for this occasion after saving up for 3 months. This was the wedding of Ethan, my only child, the boy I raised alone after Curtis died in a work accident when we were barely 35. I fixed my hair with care, put on my mother's pearl earrings, and checked the gift I had prepared for the 5th time. It was a complete set of hand-embroidered sheets that had taken me 2 months to finish, working every night after completing my daily sewing orders. The trouble started when I left my house headed for the First Metropolitan Baptist Church downtown. The main water pipe on Clover Lane had burst overnight, completely flooding the main avenue. Firefighters had blocked off 3 city blocks, forcing all traffic onto back streets I had never navigated before. My neighbor Delia yelled from her window, "Grace, you can't get out this way. It's all shut down since 5 in the morning." I had to walk 15 blocks in my high heels until I found a taxi willing to take the long route around the city periphery. By the time I arrived at First Metropolitan, the ceremony was already over. I looked for the main entrance to the reception hall, which was marked by arches, but I got confused in the parking lot and ended up walking toward the back of the venue, where there was a small garden with benches for the bridesmaids to rest between photos. That's where I heard the unmistakable voice of Tasha, my daughter-in-law, talking to her friends Kendra and Candace. Thank goodness she missed the whole ceremony. You know how she is, always with her sad stories, always talking about how hard it was raising Ethan alone, always reminding everyone she doesn't have money. It's better that she only showed up now. Kendra laughed and added, "Oh, mothers-in-law are like that, always playing the victim. My mom says it's typical of those older ladies who have nothing else to do but stick their noses in their kids' lives." Candace finished the thought. Plus, can you imagine if she had shown up in that old outfit? You can tell she doesn't know how to dress for elegant occasions. It's better this way, right? No poor mother-in-law drama. The 3 of them laughed while I stood frozen behind a bougainvillea tree, feeling their words pierce my chest like a jolt of cold electricity. Old outfit. This dress had cost me the equivalent of a week's pay. Sad stories. I only told them about my life when they asked, trying to be honest about my circumstances without sounding whiny. Poor mother-in-law drama. For 2 years, I had financially helped Ethan and Tasha with the down payment for their condo, slowly giving them my savings every month until they had the $8,000 they needed. I took a deep breath, smoothed my dress, checked my makeup in my purse mirror, and walked into the ballroom through the main door with a calm smile. "Grace, thank heavens you made it!" Ethan shouted when he saw me, running to hug me. "Mom, I thought something terrible had happened to you." I hugged him tight, inhaling the scent of his new cologne, feeling the expensive fabric of his suit against my cheek. "A pipe burst on my street, son, but I wasn't going to miss your wedding for anything in the world." Tasha approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mother Pearsall, what a shame you missed the ceremony. It was so beautiful." I kissed her on the cheek and said, "The important thing is that you're married now. God bless you both." Throughout the entire reception, I began to notice familiar behaviors that I had previously ignored or rationalized. My sister-in-law, Simone, Ethan's sister, introduced me to some people as Ethan's mom, but when other guests asked about my work or my life, she quickly changed the subject or pulled her conversation partners away. My nephew Devin, Simone's son, barely greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek before disappearing among the younger guests. My nieces, Chloe and Skylar, who used to always seek me out to chat at family gatherings, this time only exchanged courtesy greetings before finding excuses to leave. When it was time to open the gifts, I watched every reaction carefully. The expensive presents from Tasha's bridesmaids and relatives were met with genuine exclamations of joy and prolonged gratitude. When Ethan opened my package with the embroidered sheets, Tasha quickly lifted them, muttered an automatic, "Thanks, Mother Pearsall," and immediately placed them beneath the table with the other minor gifts. The sheets, on which I had invested 60 nights of labor, embroidering intertwined initials and tiny flowers, were treated as an inconvenient formality to be swiftly dealt with. It was at that moment, watching my gift of love be discarded with indifference, that the words I had heard in the garden gained a deeper meaning. It wasn't just the cruel comment of a nervous daughter-in-law on her wedding day. It was a reflection of how they truly saw me, as someone inconvenient, outdated, out of place in their prosperous modern lives. A relic from Ethan's past that they preferred to keep on the sidelines of his new married life. During dinner, I sat at a table with people I didn't know well, distant relatives of Tasha's who were polite but aloof. From my seat, I could see the main table where Ethan and Tasha were, surrounded by their closest friends, all young professionals, dressed in expensive clothes, talking about topics I didn't fully grasp: investments, international trips, exclusive restaurants. It was as if an invisible world separated us, a social barrier that I didn't know when it had been built. The dancing started with modern music I didn't recognize. The younger guests took over the floor, while the older ones remained chatting at the tables. I waited all night for Ethan to come and ask me to dance, as he always did at family parties, but he was completely absorbed in his new wife and his friends. At 11 o'clock at night, when the party was in full swing, I decided to go and say goodbye. "Son, I'm heading out now. I have to work early tomorrow." Ethan gave me a distracted hug. "Already leaving, Mom?" "Okay, have a good night. Thanks for coming." Tasha gave me an equally automatic farewell kiss. "Thanks for coming, Mother Pearsall. See you soon." But in her eyes, I saw something that confirmed what I had feared all night: relief. She was relieved I was leaving, that her perfect party could continue without the awkward presence of the humble mother-in-law who didn't fit into their new prosperous life as a couple. The cab ride home was silent. During the 40-minute drive, I mentally reviewed every detail of the night: the conversations where I was ignored, the moments where I was left talking alone, the embarrassing introductions where Simone minimized my importance, the indifference toward my gift, Ethan's lack of interest in including me in his important conversations. For the first time in my life, I began to wonder if I had been living in a bubble of self-deception, believing I was an important part of my son's life, when in reality, I was merely a family obligation to be fulfilled occasionally. That night, in my small South Side apartment, I sat in the rocking chair where I used to embroider and began to remember all the sacrifices I had made so Ethan could get to where he was. The years of working double shifts to pay for his private school when the local public schools weren't good. The times I sold my own things to buy him new clothes when he started dating Tasha, who came from an upper-middle-class family. The Sundays I spent cooking for them when they were dating, preparing elaborate dishes that Tasha photographed for her social media but never learned to cook herself. I also recalled the times Tasha had made seemingly innocent comments that now took on a different meaning. "Mother Pearsall, why don't you buy more modern clothes? Ethan has the money to help you." Or, "Doesn't it bother you that people know you're still working at your age? Ethan's a professional now." Or the time she suggested I cut my hair shorter because a woman my age looks better with short hair and less fuss. Comments I had interpreted as well-intentioned advice but now understood as attempts to control my appearance so I wouldn't socially embarrass them. That morning, as I took off the navy blue dress I had chosen with such care, I saw myself in the closet mirror, and for the first time in years, I truly saw myself as others saw me. A 67-year-old woman with gray hair, deep wrinkles on her face, rough hands from so much sewing, clothes that, though clean and well-kept, couldn't compete with the elegant standards of the social circle Ethan now belonged to. A woman who represented the humble past he preferred to keep discreet in his new prosperous married life. It was there, standing in front of that mirror at 3 a.m, when something fundamental broke inside my heart, not in a dramatic or explosive way, but like a silent crack that suddenly allowed me to see the truth I had been avoiding for months. My son no longer needed me as a present and participatory mother. He needed me as a distant, manageable memory, as a family obligation to be met occasionally, but one that didn't interfere with his real life. The next day, Sunday morning, while having coffee in my small kitchen, I began to recall all the signs I had ignored over the last year. Ethan's increasingly spaced-out visits, always in a hurry with Tasha waiting for him in the car, the increasingly short phone calls where he seemed to be doing other things while talking to me, the family invitations that arrived later and later, as if they had debated whether or not to include me for a long time. I particularly remembered a phone conversation I had accidentally overheard 3 months earlier. Ethan had come to visit me and received a call from Tasha while he was in the bathroom. She didn't know I was in the living room and spoke loudly. "Are you done over there? Kendra invited us to lunch and I don't want to be late just because we're visiting." When Ethan came out of the bathroom, I lied, saying I had gone to the garden so as not to make him feel bad. But those words had been engraved in my memory, just because we're visiting, as if coming to see his own mother was a chore to be completed quickly. Over the next 2 weeks, I decided to conduct a silent experiment. I stopped calling Ethan to see how long it would take him to contact me spontaneously. I stopped sending good morning and good night texts. I stopped asking about Tasha or their weekend plans. I simply waited to see if my communicative absence would be noticed. The results were revealing and painful. Ethan took 8 days to call me, and when he did, it was to ask for a favor. He wanted me to embroider the initials on some new shirts he had bought for work. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention that I had been strangely silent. He didn't show curiosity about my life or activities. He simply saw me as a useful resource he could turn to when he needed something specific. I agreed to embroider the shirts, but while working on them in the evenings, I began planning profound changes in how I related to the family. Not dramatic changes or elaborate revenge, but silent adjustments in my expectations and in the emotional energy I invested in relationships that clearly weren't reciprocated with the same level of affection and respect. It was then that I started noticing other details I had previously overlooked. During these years of widowhood, I had kept my house immaculate and my table always set for family visits that rarely came. I had saved money for generous gifts on birthdays and Christmas, but the gifts I received in return were always cheap and thoughtless. I had hosted elaborate family dinners where I cooked for everyone, but I was never invited to similar events at their houses. The previous week had been particularly revealing. Tasha had posted photos on Facebook of a family dinner at her parents' house, with Ethan smiling alongside all of his in-laws. I had not been invited or even mentioned the gathering. When I casually asked Ethan about the dinner, he said it had been something improvised, very intimate, and that Tasha had thought I wouldn't like the kind of food they prepared. Kind lies to justify a deliberate exclusion. 3 weeks after the wedding, while embroidering napkins no one had asked for, but which I did out of habit, the phone rang. It was Tasha. "Mother Pearsall, are you busy on Saturday? My mom wants to get to know you better, and we thought we'd have a small family lunch." Her tone was that of someone fulfilling an uncomfortable social obligation. "What are we cooking?" I asked, automatically assuming I would have to help with the preparation. "Oh no, don't worry. My mom has everything organized. Just come as a guest." On Saturday, I arrived at Tasha's parents' house in Buckhead with a dessert I had specially prepared, a rich coconut custard pie that had taken me all morning to perfect. The house was beautiful, much larger than mine, with a sprawling lawn and elegant furniture that evidenced a superior financial position. Tasha's parents, Brenda and Marcus, greeted me with correct but cold courtesy. Throughout the meal, the conversation revolved around topics I didn't know well: the trips they had taken, the expensive restaurants they had eaten at, the investments they were considering making. When I tried to participate by telling an anecdote from my work as a seamstress or my experience raising Ethan alone, I noticed that conversations abruptly stopped and were redirected toward other topics. It was as if my life experiences weren't interesting or relevant enough for that social environment. Tasha would translate my comments as if they needed explanation. My mother-in-law worked for many years sewing from home. Or, Grace went through very tough times when Ethan was little, always with a tone that sounded somewhere between compassionate and condescending. That afternoon, while I helped clear the dishes, even though they insisted it wasn't necessary, I overheard Brenda comment softly to Tasha in the kitchen. "She's a very hard-working woman, but you can tell she comes from a very different background than ours. I hope Ethan finds a balance between maintaining the family relationship and not compromising his new social status." Tasha responded, "Yes, it's complicated, but Ethan understands he has different responsibilities now." I returned home that night with a painful but liberating clarity. It wasn't just my imagination or my exaggerated sensitivity. There was a subtle, consistent campaign to minimize my presence in Ethan's new life. It wasn't malicious or consciously cruel, but the natural evolution of a family that had ascended socially and now saw the humble mother as an obstacle to their complete integration into a higher social circle. During the following days, I began to look at my own house with different eyes. The family photos filling the walls, the letters Ethan had written me from college, thanking me for all my sacrifices, the memories of the happy times we had shared when he depended completely on me. All of that belonged to the past. The adult Ethan, married, professionally successful, no longer needed the mother who had struggled to give him those opportunities. It was as if I had fulfilled my function in his life, and now it was time to discreetly retire to the background, appearing only when strictly necessary and always careful not to interfere with his new social image. The understanding of this reality didn't come with dramatic tears or cries of pain, but with a cold serenity that surprised even me. The definitive moment arrived exactly 1 month after the wedding. Ethan showed up at my house late on a Wednesday afternoon without Tasha, with a serious expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, sitting on the armchair where he used to do his high school homework. "Tasha and I have been discussing our future, the plans we have as a couple." I sat across from him with my hands folded in my lap, feeling I was about to hear something that would forever change the relationship we had built over his 32 years of life. "We want to have kids soon," he continued, "and we want to be completely sure we can offer them the best possible life. That means we have to be very careful with our finances, our social connections, the image we project as a family." "I understand," I said, even though I didn't understand exactly where the conversation was heading. "Tasha thinks it would be better if you were less frequent at our social gatherings. Not because we don't love you, but because you come from a very different world than ours, and sometimes that can create awkward situations." His words were careful, rehearsed, as if he had practiced this conversation many times before coming. "Awkward situations?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, even though I felt like something was crumbling inside my chest. "Well, you know, your comments about money, about how hard it was raising me alone, about your job. It's not wrong that you talk about it, but sometimes it makes people uncomfortable, or makes them think things we don't want them to think about our family." There was the naked truth I had been avoiding for months. My honesty about my life, my struggles, my financial limitations had become a source of shame for my son. The story of sacrifice and hard work that I considered my greatest pride was now an obstacle to the social image he wanted to project with his wife. "And what exactly are you proposing?" I asked, surprising myself with the calmness of my own voice. "That we see each other less often. That when we have important family gatherings, especially with people from work or Tasha's parents, it would be better if you didn't come. We can still have lunch together occasionally, just the two of us, but the social stuff, it would be better to keep that separate." I remained silent for several minutes, processing not just the words I had heard, but the complete reality they represented. My son, the boy I had carried in my arms on nights of fever when I didn't have money to take him to a private doctor, was asking me to become invisible in his social life so as not to compromise his new middle to upper class identity. "That's fine," I finally said, and I saw the instant relief on his face. "I understand perfectly what you're telling me." He got up to hug me, likely expecting this to be the end of a difficult but necessary conversation. But as I felt his arms around me, something deeper than sadness was settling in my heart. It was a cold clarity, a silent determination that he couldn't perceive. That night, after Ethan left with the clear conscience of having resolved the problem of his problematic mother, I sat down at my sewing table and began making plans. Not plans for revenge or family drama, but plans to completely reorganize my priorities and my emotional life. For 32 years, I had lived primarily to be Ethan's mother. It was time to discover who Grace was when she wasn't defined solely by her maternal function. The 7 days that followed that conversation with Ethan were the most silent I had lived in my Southside house since I became a widow. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for phone calls. I wasn't preparing extra food in case of visitors. I wasn't keeping the house immaculate for family visits. It was as if I had entered a parallel dimension where I could finally hear my own thoughts without the constant worry about the needs of others. During those days, I began to systematically review every corner of my house, not to clean, but to remember. Every object had a story. Every photograph held a moment I now saw with completely different eyes. In the living room cabinet, I found the letters Ethan wrote me from college, full of thanks and promises. "Mom, when I graduate, I'm going to buy you a bigger house. Thank you for all the sacrifices you've made for me. I'll never forget how hard you worked to pay for my degree." Every letter was a promise of a future where my effort would be recognized and rewarded. Now, reading them again, I realized that Ethan had technically kept his promises. He had offered me occasional financial help. He had verbally thanked me for my sacrifices. He had never publicly denied what I had done for him. But something more subtle had been lost along the way: genuine respect, natural inclusion, love that needs no explanation or justification. I had been gradually replaced by a more convenient version of myself, a mother who existed only when necessary and disappeared when she might be problematic. The Wednesday of that week, while organizing the bills from the last few months, I found the receipts for all the extra expenses I had incurred during Ethan's courtship and engagement. Small amounts that individually didn't seem significant, but when added up, represented almost 6 months of my full pension. The $50 I lent them when Tasha wanted to upgrade the refrigerator before they got married. The $100 I spent on special ingredients to make the test cake they wanted for the wedding. The $30 for the engagement gift Tasha had specifically chosen. The $20 worth of gas I spent going to try on dresses with her because she needed an older woman's opinion. Every expense had been presented as a temporary emergency or an investment in the couple's happiness, but it had never been reimbursed or even mentioned afterward. It wasn't that I expected the money back, but it bothered me that I had been so naive not to realize I was being used as a convenient economic resource while simultaneously being excluded as an inconvenient social presence. On Thursday morning, my best friend Delia came to visit, as she had done every week for 20 years. Delia had been my confidant throughout all the difficult years of widowhood, the only person who truly knew all my sacrifices and struggles to raise Ethan. She sat in the kitchen while I made coffee and immediately noticed my different mood. "What's wrong, Grace? You seem very quiet." I told her everything: the wedding, Tasha's comments, the conversation with Ethan, the request to be less socially visible. Delia listened without interrupting, but I saw a sadness in her eyes that confirmed what was happening to me was not just my exaggerated imagination. "Look, honey," she said when I finished talking, "I've seen this happen in a lot of families in the neighborhood. The kids get educated, get good jobs, marry girls from a better background, and little by little they leave behind everything that reminds them where they came from. It's not that they're bad. They're just ashamed of their humble past." Her words hurt because they confirmed what I had been afraid to recognize. "But Ethan's not like that," I protested weakly. "He's never denied that we come from a working-class family." Delia took my hand across the table. "No, honey, he doesn't deny it when he's alone with you. But when was the last time Tasha came to this house? When was the last time Ethan took you to meet his co-workers? When was the last time he included you in his plans without you having to ask?" Delia's questions forced me to face a reality I had been avoiding. Tasha had come to my house exactly 3 times in 2 years of dating, always for very short periods, and always with excuses to leave quickly. Ethan had never invited me to any of his work events, not even the holiday parties where families were included. When I suggested family plans, there were always reasons why it was better to wait for a more convenient time. "What would you do if you were me?" I asked Delia, feeling for the first time that I truly needed someone else's advice. "I think you have to decide what you want for the rest of your life," she replied. "Do you want to continue being the mother who is always available when they need her, but becomes invisible when it's convenient? Or do you want to live for yourself for the first time in 30 years? That afternoon, after Delia left, I sat in my favorite rocking chair and began a mental exercise I had never done before, imagining what my life would be like if I wasn't constantly worried about Ethan and Tasha. What would I do with my free evenings if I wasn't embroidering gifts that no one truly appreciated? How would I spend my money if I wasn't setting aside amounts for family emergencies that always seemed to pop up? What plans would I make if I didn't have to keep my schedule flexible in case they needed me? For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream of personal projects. I had always wanted to learn to use a computer so I could communicate with old coworkers who had moved to other cities. I had wanted to take more advanced embroidery classes to perfect techniques I only knew by sight. I had wanted to travel to Charleston to visit my sister Maya, who had invited me many times, but whom I always told I couldn't leave the house alone in case Ethan needed me. On Friday night, while having dinner alone in front of the television, the phone rang. It was Ethan. "Hi, Mom. How are you? I was just calling to say hello." His voice had that careful tone he used when he wanted to make sure I wasn't upset about something. "Fine, son. Just doing my thing," I replied, keeping my own voice neutral. "Have you thought about what we talked about the other day?" he asked. I could detect the anxiety behind the casual question. He wanted confirmation that I had fully accepted his request to reduce my presence in his social life. "Yes, I've thought about it a lot," I said. "And I think you're right. It's better for everyone to have their own space." I heard the relief in his breathing. "I'm so glad you see it that way, Mom. I don't want you to think we don't love you. We just want everyone to be comfortable." After hanging up, I kept thinking about that word, comfortable. It was interesting how their comfort required my discomfort, how their peace of mind needed my silence. Over the weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I didn't plan anything with Ethan in mind. I didn't cook his favorite food in case he decided to visit. I didn't clean the house extra in case he came with Tasha. I didn't dress up in case they invited me out. I simply lived my weekend as if I were completely independent, and the feeling was strangely liberating. On Sunday morning, I went to Mass alone at St. Thomas Parish, where I had gone for 20 years, but where I had lately only shown up when Ethan and Tasha didn't have other plans for me. After Mass, I stayed to chat with Beatrice, a woman my age who had recently been widowed and who always asked about Ethan with genuine interest. "And how is the young man? Has he gotten used to married life?" she asked as we walked toward the exit. For the first time, I decided to be completely honest. "Well, yes, he's getting very used to it, so used to it that he barely needs his mother anymore." Beatrice looked at me with understanding. "Oh, honey, that happens with all children when they get married. You raise them thinking they'll be our companions forever, but the truth is, you're raising them to leave." Her words were like a flash of clarity. All these years I had thought I was investing in a relationship that would grow stronger over time, but in reality, I had been preparing Ethan to become completely independent of me. The problem wasn't that he had pulled away. The problem was that I hadn't prepared to live my own life when I was no longer needed as an active mother. That afternoon, I decided to do something symbolic but important. I completely reorganized my house to work for me alone, not as a space always ready to receive family visits. I stored the extra dining chairs. I turned the guest room into my own sewing studio. I moved my favorite books to the main living area instead of keeping them hidden in the bedroom. I changed the kitchen layout to be more comfortable for a single person. Every small change was a declaration of emotional independence. This house was no longer going to be a museum of motherhood where everything was preserved for the convenience of a son who came less and less. It was going to be the home of Grace Pearsall, a 67-year-old woman who had finally decided to live for herself. On Monday morning, I started implementing more significant changes. I called the computer school at the community center and enrolled in the basic course that started that week. I called my sister Maya in Charleston and told her I wanted to visit her next month. I went to the bank and opened a separate savings account where I deposited half of my pension, money that would no longer be available for Ethan and Tasha's family emergencies. Every action was small individually, but together they represented a silent revolution in how I lived. For 30 years, I had been Ethan's mother. Now it was time to discover who Grace was when she wasn't defined solely by her maternal function. On Tuesday afternoon, while practicing on my new computer, which I had bought that very morning with money from my personal savings, I received a call from Tasha. "Mother Pearsall, how are you? I'm calling because my mom wants to invite you to lunch on Saturday. Nothing formal, just a ladies' lunch." It was the first time Tasha had called me directly in weeks, and I could detect something artificial in her overly friendly tone. "Will Ethan be there?" I asked. "No, it's just a ladies' lunch. My mom, my Aunt Rose, you, and me." I thought for a moment. 3 weeks ago, I would have immediately accepted, grateful for any family inclusion, but now I had the perspective to recognize that this was probably an attempt to fulfill the social obligation of including the mother-in-law occasionally while maintaining control over when and how that inclusion happened. "Tasha, thank you very much for the invitation, but I already have plans for Saturday," I said, surprising myself with the ease of my refusal. "Oh, well, don't worry. We'll do it another time," she replied, and I could hear the surprise in her voice. She had clearly expected me to automatically accept any crumb of family attention offered. After hanging up, I realized I really did have plans for Saturday, my first advanced computer class, and a visit to the San Juan market to buy materials for my personal embroidery projects, plans I had made thinking only of my own enjoyment, without considering whether they interfered with Ethan and Tasha's needs or wishes. On Wednesday, I received an unexpected call from my sister-in-law Simone, the one who had been especially cold to me at the wedding. "Grace, how are you? I'm calling because my son Devin is having his first communion next month, and we wanted to invite you." Another invitation that arrived weeks in advance, probably after much family debate about whether or not to include me. "Simone, thank you very much for thinking of me," I replied. "Can I confirm next week? I'm organizing my calendar and want to be sure I can attend properly." It was a diplomatic answer that gave me time to decide if I truly wanted to participate in family events where my presence was merely tolerated rather than desired. On Thursday night, while having a quiet dinner in my reorganized kitchen, I realized something fundamental. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel anxious waiting for phone calls. I wasn't watching the phone, hoping Ethan would need me for something. I wasn't mentally preparing excuses in case I had to cancel my own plans to attend to a family emergency. This new emotional independence hadn't arrived with dramatic pain, but with a gradual serenity that surprised me. It was as if I had been carrying an invisible weight for years and had finally given myself permission to put it down. The love for Ethan remained intact, but it was no longer mixed with the constant anxiety of proving I deserved his attention and respect. On Friday morning, while having breakfast and reading a book I had bought simply because I liked the cover, another luxury I hadn't allowed myself in years, the phone rang. It was Ethan, but this time his voice held a note of confusion. "Mom, Tasha told me you can't go to lunch on Saturday. Is everything okay? Are you feeling sick?" "No, son, I'm perfectly fine," I replied. "I just have other commitments." "What commitments?" he asked, and I could detect the genuine surprise in his voice. Evidently, it hadn't occurred to him that I could have a social life independent of my availability for family events. "I'm taking computer classes and I have things to do for the house," I explained, keeping my tone casual. "Oh," was all he replied, as if he were processing the information that his mother had priorities that didn't revolve around him. After hanging up, I kept thinking about that conversation. For years, any family invitation had automatically been my highest priority, regardless of what other plans I might have. Ethan had grown up expecting that unconditional availability as something natural. Now, encountering boundaries for the first time, he didn't know how to interpret the situation. That afternoon, while organizing my new embroidery materials in my personal studio, I received a text message from Tasha. "Mother Pearsall, I hope you're not upset about something. If there's a problem, we can talk." It was interesting how my simple refusal to be immediately available had been interpreted as a sign of conflict. For years, my compliance had been so predictable that any different behavior was seen as problematic. I replied with a calm message. "I'm not upset, Tasha. I'm just organizing my time differently. Thank you very much for the invitation." It was a response that made it clear there was no drama, but also offered no extensive explanations or apologies for having my own priorities. Saturday was the first day in years that I dedicated completely to my own interests. In the morning, I went to my computer class, where I met other women my age who were also learning technology after years of dedicating themselves exclusively to their families. In the afternoon, I went to the market and bought colored threads I had never used, special fabrics I had admired but never allowed myself to buy for personal projects. That night, while having dinner in my quiet kitchen, I realized I had spent an entire day without thinking about Ethan and Tasha, except occasionally. It was the first time in decades that my mind was occupied with my own projects, my own learning, my own satisfactions. The feeling was strange, but deeply reassuring. On Sunday morning, while watering the plants in my small garden, my neighbor Delia approached the fence separating our houses. "Say, honey, doesn't Ethan come on Sundays anymore? I haven't seen him around here for weeks." It was an innocent question, but one that made me reflect on how my internal changes were starting to become visible externally. "Well, he's married now, right? Everyone has their own life," I replied, surprised by the naturalness of my answer. 3 months ago, I would have explained in detail the reasons why Ethan was coming less, probably justifying his absence and minimizing any impression that there were family problems. Delia nodded with understanding. "That's life, honey. The children grow up, and you have to learn to live for yourself again. And how are you doing? How are you organizing yourself?" It was the first time someone had specifically asked about my well-being independent of my family situation. "Very well," I said, and realized it was completely true. "I'm learning new things, doing projects I had put off. I'm really enjoying having time for myself." Delia smiled. "I'm so glad to hear that. You seem very peaceful lately." That afternoon, while working on a complex embroidery piece I was doing just because I liked the design, not because it was a gift for someone, I reflected on the profound changes that had occurred within me over those 2 weeks. The initial pain of recognizing my new position in Ethan's life had transformed into something more constructive. The determination to build an identity that did not depend on my function as a mother. For the first time in 30 years, Grace Pearsall was living for Grace Pearsall, and contrary to what I had feared, the world had not collapsed. Ethan and Tasha were perfectly fine without my constant attention. The house was still functioning without being constantly ready for unexpected family visits. My life had rhythm and purpose, without being centered on the needs of others. It was as if I had been holding my breath for decades, and had finally given myself permission to exhale completely. The air entering my lungs was different, cleaner, fresher, completely mine. The real transformation began exactly 3 weeks after my conversation with Ethan on a Monday morning when I decided to do something I had never done in my 67 years of life. Write a list of everything I wanted to achieve, thinking only of my own happiness, without considering how it would affect Ethan, Tasha, or anyone else in my family. I sat at my sewing table, now converted into a personal desk, with a new notebook I had bought specifically for this purpose, and began to write without censoring myself. I want to learn to use the computer well to communicate with people my age who have similar interests. I want to travel to Charleston to see Maya and stay as long as I want without asking if anyone needs me at home. I want to take advanced embroidery classes at the Community Arts Center. I want to buy new clothes that I like, not what is appropriate for a woman my age. I want to go to the movies alone without feeling I have to justify why I'm not accompanied. Every line I wrote was a small declaration of independence. For the first time in decades, I was formulating desires that had nothing to do with being useful to others, but with discovering who I was when I wasn't defined by my family roles. That same afternoon, I began implementing my list systematically and silently. I called the Buckhead Art Center and enrolled in the artistic embroidery workshop that started on Thursday. I didn't mention this decision to anyone. I simply made it as any other independent adult would make a personal decision. I went to the mall and bought 3 bright-colored blouses that I liked the moment I saw them, without wondering if they were too youthful or if Ethan would approve of my choices. On Tuesday, I booked my bus ticket to Charleston for the following week, buying an open return ticket. When Maya asked me over the phone how long I planned to stay, I said something that surprised myself. I don't know exactly. It depends on how good I feel there. It was the first time in years that I had made plans without a predetermined deadline based on Ethan's potential needs. On Wednesday, I did something even more radical. I went to the bank and completely modified the distribution of my pension. Instead of keeping all the money available in my checking account for family emergencies, I divided my income into 4 categories: basic household expenses, personal savings, a real emergency fund, and a monthly budget for personal activities and pleasures. For the first time in my adult life, a significant portion of my money was destined exclusively for my personal enjoyment. These seemingly small changes represented a silent revolution in how I lived. For 30 years, I had operated as if my life were a shared resource, where my decisions, my time, and my money were always subject to Ethan's needs. Now, I was reclaiming my complete autonomy, not aggressively or dramatically, but with the quiet determination of someone who had finally understood her own worth. On Thursday, in my first embroidery class, I met a group of women who would change my perspective on what it meant to be an independent, older woman. There was Ophelia, 72 years old, who had started painting professionally after being widowed at 65. Gloria, 69, who had learned to drive and now traveled alone all over the country. Alicia, 71, who had gone back to school and had just finished her GED. All of them had lived decades completely dedicated to their families and were now discovering talents and passions they had never had time to explore. The secret, Ophelia told me while we practiced a new shading technique, is to stop asking for permission to live your own life. Our kids aren't children who need us to survive anymore, but we're still alive and we have the right to do things that make us happy. Her words resonated within me because they expressed exactly what I had been feeling, but hadn't known how to articulate so clearly. Gloria added, I spent 40 years waiting for my kids to invite me to their plans, for my husband to include me in his decisions, for my family to give me a place in their lives, until one day I realized I also have the right to make my own plans and invite whomever I want. Alicia completed the thought. The problem is that we teach our children that mom is always going to be available, always going to say yes, always going to put their needs before her own, and then we're surprised when they treat us exactly the way we taught them. That conversation was like hearing my own thoughts expressed by wiser, more experienced voices. I wasn't the only woman of my generation who had confused maternal love with complete self-negation. I wasn't the only one who had raised successful children at the cost of completely forgetting who she was herself. And more importantly, it wasn't too late to change this dynamic. On Friday, armed with this new perspective, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks ago. Ethan called me to ask if I could watch Simone's kids on Saturday because she and her husband wanted to go out and had no one to leave them with. It was exactly the kind of request I had automatically accepted for years, canceling any personal plan to be available for family needs. Ethan, I said with a calmness that surprised me, I won't be able to. I already have commitments for Saturday. What commitments? He asked, with the same tone of genuine surprise he had used the previous week. I'm going to the movies with some friends from my embroidery class, and afterward, we're going to dinner together. It was completely true. We had made these plans the day before. "But Mom, Simone really needs someone to watch the children. She doesn't know anyone else she trusts." His response revealed something fundamental. For years, I had been the automatic solution for any childcare problem in the family. Not because I was the best option, but because I was the only one who never said no. "I'm sure they'll find another solution," I replied. "There are plenty of responsible babysitters, or they can ask one of Simone's friends." Ethan was silent for a moment, clearly processing that his mother was not offering alternatives or committing to solving Simone's problem. "Is everything okay, Mom? Lately I have noticed you're very different." It was the first time Ethan had verbalized that he had noticed changes in my behavior. "I'm doing very well, son. I'm just learning to organize my time differently." "Differently how?" "By including things that I like, not just the things the family needs." After hanging up, I realized I had crossed an invisible but crucial line. For the first time, I had put my own plans ahead of a non-urgent family need. Ethan would have to explain to Simone that his mother was no longer automatically available as an emergency babysitter. Simone would have to find solutions that didn't depend on my unconditional availability. It was a small but revolutionary change. On Saturday, I had an experience I hadn't had in decades. An entire day of adult fun with women my age who shared my interests. We went to the movies to see a Mexican film about an older woman who decided to change her life after being widowed. Afterward, we had dinner at a restaurant where none of us had to cook, serve, or clean. We talked about our personal projects, the books we were reading, and the trips we wanted to take. It was like rediscovering a part of myself that had been dormant for so long that I had forgotten existed. Grace the woman, not just Grace the mother of Ethan. Throughout the night, I didn't receive a single phone call asking where I was or when I would be back. Ethan and Tasha had sorted out their weekend without needing to include or consult me, exactly as it should be between independent adults. On Sunday morning, while having a quiet breakfast and reading a book Gloria had lent me about women who had reinvented their lives after 60, the phone rang. It was Tasha, and her voice had a note of thinly veiled irritation. "Mother Pearsall, Simone told us you couldn't watch the children yesterday. I hope it wasn't because of some discomfort." "No, Tasha, it wasn't because of any discomfort. I simply had other plans," I replied, keeping my tone polite but firm. "Oh well, Simone was left with no options and had to cancel her outing with her husband. We thought maybe it was a misunderstanding." It was fascinating how my simple refusal was being interpreted as a problem that needed explanation or correction. "There was no misunderstanding," I told her. "I also have a social life and personal plans. Simone had several days to organize a sitter if she really needed to go out." Tasha fell silent for a moment, clearly not expecting me to defend my decision so directly. "Well, I just wanted to make sure everything was okay," she finally said. "Everything is perfectly fine, Tasha. Thank you for asking." After hanging up, I realized I had set an important precedent. My personal decisions did not require extensive justifications or apologies to the family. That afternoon, while packing for my trip to Charleston, which would begin the next day, I reflected on the profound changes that had occurred within me over those 3 weeks. There had been no dramatic confrontations or emotional discussions about my hurt feelings. I had simply started acting like the independent person I had always had the right to be, but had forgotten how to be. Early on Monday, while waiting for the bus at the station, I received a text message from Ethan. "Mom, Tasha told me you're going on a trip. Why didn't you let us know sooner? When are you coming back?" It was interesting how a week-long personal trip was being treated as if it were a decision that required prior family approval. I replied from the bus, "Son, I'm a 67-year-old adult. I don't need to ask permission to visit my sister. I'll be back when my visit is over. Love you both." It was a message that established clear yet loving boundaries. I could love my family without being obligated to report every movement of my personal life. During the 4-hour trip to Charleston, I dedicated myself to watching the scenery and reflecting on the woman I had been 3 weeks ago versus the woman I was now. The main difference wasn't that I had stopped loving Ethan, but that I had stopped using his approval as the sole measure of my self-worth. His happiness was still important to me, but it was no longer more important than my own happiness. Maya greeted me at her Charleston home with a genuine joy I hadn't experienced in years. "Sister, I'm so glad you finally decided to come. You look different, more relaxed or something." Her observation confirmed that the internal changes were being reflected externally in ways I hadn't fully noticed myself. During my first night in Charleston, while having dinner on her porch and chatting about our deceased siblings, our memories of youth, and our plans for the years we had left to live, I realized something fundamental. It had been years since I had a conversation where Ethan or his needs weren't mentioned. For the first time in decades, I was simply Grace, talking with her sister about topics that interested both of us as independent adult women. "You know what?" Maya said after I told her about my embroidery classes and new friends. "I always thought you were too dedicated to Ethan. It's not wrong to be a good mother, but you completely forgot to be Grace." Her words were direct, but spoken with kindness, as only a sister can speak uncomfortable truths. "You're right," I admitted, "but it's never too late to remember who you are, is it?" Maya smiled. "Not at all. In fact, I think your 60s and 70s can be a woman's best years if she finally gives herself permission to live for herself." That night, in the guest room of Maya's house, I went to bed with a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in decades, I wasn't worried about whether Ethan needed me for something, whether I had left everything organized at home, or whether my absence was causing family inconvenience. I was simply enjoying being in a new place with my dear sister, living an experience I had chosen solely because it made me happy. The next 5 days in Charleston were a continuous revelation. Maya took me to see the sweetgrass basket workshops where artists our age had started their careers after 60. We visited colonial churches where I stopped to admire antique needlework without rushing and without having to watch the clock. We went to the artisan market where I bought materials for personal projects without wondering if the expense was justifiable. But the most important thing was that during those days, I rediscovered aspects of my personality that had been dormant for decades. It turned out I had very defined opinions about art, that I liked to debate American history, that I thoroughly enjoyed walking down unfamiliar streets without a specific destination. It was like reconnecting with a version of myself that had existed before my entire identity was defined in terms of my maternal role. On Wednesday of my stay in Charleston, I received a call from Ethan that revealed the extent to which my changes were affecting the established family dynamic. "Mom, when exactly are you coming back? Tasha wants to organize a family dinner for the weekend, and we need to know if you'll be available." "Ethan," I said, while admiring the harbor from Maya's porch, "I don't know exactly when I'll be back. I'm very comfortable here with my sister." "What do you mean you don't know? Didn't you buy a return ticket?" "I bought an open ticket so I could come back whenever I feel like it." The silence on the other end of the line indicated that Ethan was processing something completely new. A mother who didn't have fixed plans based on family needs, but was living spontaneously according to her own desires. "But Mom, Tasha already started planning the dinner. She's inviting her parents, and she wanted you to be there." It was fascinating how the dinner was being presented as a favor they were doing for me, when in reality, they needed my presence to complete their image of a harmonious family. "Tell Tasha to organize her dinner without counting on me," I replied, with a calmness that surprised me. "If I'm back by that day and don't have other plans, I'll gladly join you, but she shouldn't base her plans on my availability, because I don't have a fixed return date." After hanging up, Maya looked at me with a proud smile. "That's my sister. It was about time you taught them that you have a life of your own, too." Her words confirmed that I was on the right path toward healthy emotional independence. On Friday, I decided to extend my visit by 1 more week, not because I had specific plans, but because I simply didn't feel like going back yet. I called Ethan to inform him of my decision. "Son, I'm going to stay in Charleston for another week. Maya's going to take me to see Savannah and some towns in the region." "Another week, Mom? You've already been there almost a week." His tone revealed a mix of surprise and something that sounded like impatience. "Yes, and I'm going to stay another week because I'm really enjoying this experience. My house will still be there when I get back, Ethan, and so will my things." It was the first time in my adult life that I was making decisions based solely on what I felt like doing, without considering how it would affect others or if it was what was expected of me. The feeling was terrifying and liberating at the same time, like learning to walk again after years of using emotional crutches. That night, while Maya and I planned our excursion to Savannah, I received a message from Tasha that revealed the true level of my transformation. "Mother Pearsall, we understand you want to enjoy your trip, but Ethan is worried because you've never been away from home for so long. We just want to make sure you're okay." I replied, "Tasha, I'm perfectly fine. I'm on vacation with my sister, something I should have done years ago. Ethan doesn't need to worry about an adult woman who is visiting her family in another state." It was a message that clearly established that my well-being did not require constant family supervision. At the end of my second week in Charleston, as I packed to return home because I had decided it was time to go back, not because anyone had asked me to, I reflected on the profound transformation that had occurred during this time. It hadn't been a dramatic revolution with emotional confrontations, but a silent evolution toward complete emotional independence. During the trip back to Atlanta, I observed my reflection in the bus window and saw a different woman from the one who had left 2 weeks earlier. She was the same Grace physically, but there was something in her eyes that was new, a serenity that came from having rediscovered her own worth independent of her function as a mother. When I arrived at my Southside house that afternoon, I found several messages on my answering machine from Ethan, asking what time I would arrive, if I needed to be picked up at the station, and if everything was okay. But for the first time, I didn't feel the urgency to call immediately to reassure everyone about my well-being. First, I took a relaxing bath, unpacked calmly, and prepared a light dinner for myself. Only then, when I was ready and comfortable, did I call Ethan. "Son, I'm home. Everything went great. I'll tell you about the trip tomorrow." "Mom, we were worried. Why didn't you call as soon as you arrived?" "Ethan, I'm a responsible adult. I don't need to report every movement of my life. See you soon." That night, in my house reorganized for my personal comfort, I went to bed with the deep satisfaction of someone who had achieved something very difficult, transforming a toxic family dynamic without the need for dramatic confrontations or explosive breakups. I had reclaimed my emotional autonomy simply by exercising it day by day, decision by decision. The most significant change wasn't in how Ethan and Tasha treated me, though that had also improved substantially. The most important change was in how I saw myself. I no longer needed their approval to validate my existence. I no longer measured my worth by my utility to them. I no longer lived waiting for them to include me in their lives. Now, I had my own rich and satisfying life, in which they could participate if they wanted and if they respected me appropriately. 2 months after that transformative conversation, while working on a complex embroidery piece in my personal studio, the phone rang. It was Ethan. "Mom, do you have plans for Sunday? Tasha and I want to do something special with you." "What kind of something special?" I asked, genuinely curious. "We want to take you to visit an artist's studio that was recommended to us. We thought you'd like to see how he works, because he specializes in traditional African American textile work." It was an invitation based on my personal interests, not their family needs. "I love the idea," I said. "What time will you pick me up?" "Does 10 in the morning sound good?" "Perfect. I'll be waiting for you there." It was a simple but revolutionary conversation, an invitation that included me because they specifically wanted my company, not because they needed something from me. That Sunday, as we walked through the textile artist's studio and I explained techniques I recognized from my years of sewing experience, I saw something in Ethan and Tasha's eyes that had been absent for years, genuine respect for my knowledge and experience. I was no longer just the mom with stories from the past. I was Grace, a woman with valuable expertise and unique perspective. The artist, A man in his 50s named Arturo asked me technical questions about traditional embroidery that I was able to answer with detail and precision. Ethan and Tasha observed me with something that looked like surprise, as if they were rediscovering aspects of my personality they had taken for granted or ignored for years. "I didn't know you knew so much about textile history," Tasha said as we drove home. "It never occurred to me to ask," Ethan added. "It's impressive how you can identify the techniques and regions of origin just by looking at the patterns." Their comments made me reflect on how much knowledge and experience I had kept silent for years, not because I didn't want to share it, but because there had never been space in our family conversations for me to be the expert, the one who had something interesting to teach. That afternoon, after they dropped me off at home, I sat in my favorite rocking chair and mentally reviewed the path I had traveled since that wedding night when I heard Tasha celebrate my absence. The woman who had been hurt by those comments no longer existed. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who had built a rich and independent life, and who had taught her family to respect her, not out of pity or obligation, but out of genuine recognition of who she was as a person. The phone rang, interrupting my reflections. It was my friend Gloria from the embroidery workshop. "Grace, what are your plans for tomorrow? Ophelia wants us to go with her to see an exhibition of folk art at the Fulton County Arts Center." "I love the idea," I replied immediately. "What time should we meet?" As I talked with Gloria about our plans, I realized something that filled me with deep satisfaction. I had an active social life that didn't depend on Ethan and Tasha. I had personal projects that excited me. I had friends who valued my company regardless of what I could do for them. I was no longer a woman who existed on the margins of her son's life. I was a woman with a life of her own who generously included her family when the respect was mutual. The final lesson wasn't that I had stopped loving Ethan or cut my family ties. The lesson was that I had learned to love myself with the same intensity with which I had loved others for decades. And that self-love had transformed all my relationships, not just the family one, making them more authentic, more balanced, and paradoxically, more loving. That night, as I prepared my clothes for the next day, which included a cultural outing with my friends and a dinner Ethan and Tasha had invited me to a week in advance, I smiled, thinking about the woman I had been and the woman I was now. Both had loved deeply, but only one had learned that true love begins with oneself and extends toward others from a place of fullness, not from an emptiness that needs to be filled by external approval. 6 months had passed since that transformative conversation with Ethan and Tasha, and as I watered my geraniums in the small garden I had completely redesigned to my own taste, I reflected on the serene woman I had become. It was a perfect October morning in Southside Atlanta with that golden light that makes everything seem possible, and for the first time in decades, I felt completely at peace with the direction my life had taken. My morning routine had evolved into something I never would have imagined at 67. I got up at 6:30, not because I had to make breakfast for someone else or be ready in case they needed me early, but because I had discovered that the first hours of the day were my most creative and peaceful time. I made coffee in my new coffee maker, another personal whim I had indulged in, sat on the porch I had decorated with plants and a comfortable rocker, and spent a full hour simply existing without a specific agenda. During those silent moments, I watched how the light changed on the leaves of my plants. I listened to the sounds of the neighborhood gradually waking up and allowed my thoughts to flow without a particular direction. It was a luxury I hadn't given myself in 30 years, the luxury of not mentally organizing the day's tasks based on the needs of others, but simply breathing and being present in my own life. After coffee, I went to my sewing studio, which I had converted into a truly personal space. The walls were decorated with my favorite embroidery pieces, not because they were gifts for someone, but because I liked seeing my work well displayed. The large table I had bought allowed me to spread out complex projects without having to constantly put everything away to make space for other family activities. It was my space, organized according to my comfort and my creative needs. That morning, I was working on a large format tapestry that I had designed myself, inspired by traditional African motifs, but with my personal interpretation of the colors and shapes. It was a project that would take me months to complete, but that was precisely its beauty. It was something I was doing solely for my own enjoyment, with no deadline, no external pressure, no need to justify the time or materials invested. As I embroidered, my mind frequently returned to the transformation I had undergone, not just in my relationship with Ethan and Tasha, but in my relationship with myself. The woman who had heard those cruel comments at the wedding no longer existed. In her place was a woman who knew her intrinsic worth, who had learned to set boundaries without guilt, and who had discovered talents and passions that had been dormant for decades. The deepest change wasn't visible from the outside, but lay in the internal silence I had managed to cultivate. For years my mind had been a constant murmur of worries about Ethan. Had he eaten well? Would he need something? Was he upset with me about something? What could I do to make sure he kept needing me? Now that murmur had been replaced by a deep serenity that allowed me to think of him with love, but without anxiety, to care about his well-being without feeling I had to solve all his problems. At 10 in the morning, as I had done for the last 3 months, I prepared for my daily walk through the trails of the Southside Greenway Park. It was an activity I had started on a doctor's recommendation to maintain my physical health, but which had become one of my favorite times of the day. During those 40 minutes of walking, I contemplated nature, greeted other neighbors who were also exercising, and simply enjoyed the movement of my body in the space. On one of the park benches, I met Beatrice, a 73-year-old woman who had recently been widowed and was going through the process I had experienced months earlier, rediscovering who she was when she wasn't defined solely by her traditional family roles. "Good morning, Grace," she greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How are you?" "Very well, Beatrice. And how are things going at your house?" I knew her children had been pressuring her to move to a smaller apartment and sell the house where she had lived for 40 years. "Well, we're managing," she sighed. "My children insist that the house is too big for me alone, that it's too much work to maintain. But that house holds all my history, you know? I don't know if I'm ready to leave it." Her words vividly reminded me of my own internal struggles when I was learning to differentiate between what I really wanted and what others thought I should want. "Beatrice," I said, sitting beside her on the bench, "what do you want to do? Not what your children think is best, not what is most practical according to others, but what you truly desire in your heart." She looked at me with surprise, as if it were the first time someone had specifically asked about her own desires. "Well, I'd like to stay in my house," she admitted timidly. "I like my garden. I know all my neighbors. I have my routine set up, but my children say I'm stubborn, that I won't accept that things have to change." It was the same dynamic I had experienced. Adult children who confused genuine care with control over their mother's decisions. "And can you maintain the house financially? Do you feel safe living alone?" I asked her, addressing the real practical questions instead of the emotional ones. "Yes, to both things," she replied immediately. "I have my pension, the house is paid off, and I feel perfectly safe. It's just that my children think a woman my age shouldn't live alone in a big house." I smiled at her with understanding. "Beatrice, you are a competent adult who has the right to make your own decisions as long as you are able to do so. If you want to stay in your house and can do so, that is your decision, not your children's." She saw something in my eyes that reassured her. "Do you really think it's okay for me to tell my children no when they insist I move?" "I think it's okay for you to live your life according to your own wishes and needs," I replied. "Children sometimes forget that their mothers are still independent people with the right to make decisions, even when those decisions aren't the ones they would make." We talked for 20 more minutes, and when we said goodbye, Beatrice had a more determined expression, as if she had recalled something important about her own worth and autonomy. That conversation made me reflect on how many women of my generation were struggling with similar family dynamics, and how my own transformation had turned me into a kind of involuntary role model for others who were seeking their path toward late emotional independence. Upon returning home, I found a message on my answering machine from my sister Maya in Charleston. "Grace, just calling to say hello and tell you that my neighbor Rosario is going through something very similar to what you experienced with Ethan. I told her your story, and she wants to know if she can call you to talk. She said she needs to hear from someone who managed to change that dynamic without losing the family." It was interesting how my personal experience had become a source of inspiration for other women in similar situations. Over the last few months, I had received several calls from Maya's friends, acquaintances from my embroidery class, and even neighbors who had heard about my transformation and wanted advice on how to set healthy boundaries with adult children. I called Maya back immediately. "Sister, of course Rosario can call me. You know I'd be happy to help other women who are going through this." "Oh, Grace," Maya said affectionately, "you don't know what an impressive change you've made. I listened to you, and you sound like a different person, more self-assured, more peaceful. It's as if you've found your place in the world." Her words moved me because they captured exactly what I felt. I had found my place in the world, not as an appendage to Ethan's life, but as Grace Pearsall, a complete woman with her own interests, talents, relationships, and projects. That afternoon, I had my weekly advanced embroidery class at the Arts Center, where I had progressed so much that the teacher, Carmen, curiously the same name as my daughter-in-law but a completely different personality, had asked me to help teach some basic techniques to new students. It was the first time in years that someone had seen me as an expert in something, as someone whose knowledge was valuable and worthy of being passed on. During the class, I worked with Norma, a 45-year-old woman who had started embroidering as therapy after a difficult divorce. "Grace," she said as I showed her how to make a particularly complex stitch, "you have incredible patience for teaching. You can tell you really enjoy sharing what you know." Her words filled me with satisfaction because they confirmed something I had discovered about myself. I had a natural talent for teaching and found great joy in helping others develop their skills. The teacher, Carmen, approached while I was explaining the technique. "Grace, I've been thinking about something. Would you be interested in teaching a Saturday morning workshop for ladies who want to learn traditional American folk embroidery? We have a lot of requests, but we need someone with your experience and patience." It was a proposal that deeply excited me. The possibility of turning my passion into a formal activity that benefited others and gave me a sense of professional purpose at 67. "I love the idea," I replied immediately. "When could we start?" "In 2 weeks, if that works for you. It would be a 6-session workshop, and of course, we would pay you for your time." It was the first time in my life that someone had offered me money to do something I genuinely enjoyed, not out of economic necessity, but as recognition of the value of my skills. That night, while having a quiet dinner in my reorganized kitchen and thinking about the teaching proposal, the phone rang. It was Ethan. "Hi, Mom. How are you? Am I interrupting you?" His way of asking had changed significantly in recent months. Now he acknowledged that I might have activities or commitments that didn't revolve around his availability. "You're not interrupting, son. I just finished dinner. How are you and Tasha?" "Very well, Mom. In fact, that's why I was calling. Tasha wants to invite you to a special dinner on Friday. It's our 6-month wedding anniversary, and we want to celebrate it with you." It was the type of invitation I had learned to expect, planned in advance, based on including my presence as something desired, not as something assumed. "That's lovely, son. I'm so happy you want to celebrate with me. What time would it be?" "Does 7 o'clock sound good? We thought we'd go to a new restaurant you'll like. It specializes in modern Southern cuisine." The description of the restaurant showed they had considered my tastes when making the plans, not just their own. "Perfect, I'll be there," I confirmed. "Mom," Ethan added, with a note of genuine affection in his voice, "Tasha and I were talking about how proud we are to see everything you're achieving, your classes, your projects, your new friends. You look so happy lately." His words moved me because they showed a level of observation and appreciation that I hadn't experienced before. "Thank you, son. I am very happy. I've truly discovered aspects of myself that I didn't know existed." "And it shows," he said. "Tasha always comments on how interesting it is to talk with you now that we talk about your projects and not just about us." It was a perceptive observation that confirmed the dynamic of our conversations had fundamentally changed. After hanging up, I sat in my reorganized living room and allowed a deep sense of gratitude to wash over me for the journey I had traveled. The woman who had been hurt by Tasha's comments at the wedding had used that pain as a catalyst for a transformation that had enriched not only her own life, but also her family relationships. The Friday night anniversary dinner was a revelation of how much our family dynamics had changed. For the first time in years, I spent an entire evening with Ethan and Tasha where I felt seen, heard, and valued as an independent person. We talked about the new workshop I was going to teach, the books I was reading, and my plans to travel to Charleston again, and perhaps explore other southern cities. Tasha specifically asked me about the embroidery techniques I was learning, showing genuine technical interest, not just social courtesy. Ethan asked me for advice on how to decorate a wall in their condo, valuing my aesthetic judgment after years of dismissing it as old-fashioned. It was as if they had finally discovered they had a mother with her own personality, valuable knowledge, and interesting perspectives. During dessert, Tasha made a comment that surprised me with its depth. "Mother Pearsall, I've been reflecting a lot about my relationship with my own mom. I realized I was making the same mistakes with her that we used to make with you, taking her for granted, not considering her personal interests, assuming she'll always be available for what we need." It was an observation that showed how my transformation had generated waves of awareness beyond our immediate relationship. Ethan added, "I've been thinking about that too. It's easy to see our mothers only as mothers, not as complete women with lives of their own. I think that's a mistake a lot of children make." His words indicated a level of self-awareness that filled me with hope for the future of our family relationships. At the end of the night, when Ethan walked me to my car, he did something he hadn't done in years. He asked me specifically about my emotional well-being, not just my physical health. "Mom, are you happy with the changes you've made in your life?" It was a question that showed genuine interest in my inner state, not just my functionality as an available mother. "Very happy, son," I replied with complete honesty. For the first time in many years, I feel like I'm living my own life, not just existing based on the needs of others. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I'm so glad to hear you say that, and I'm very ashamed that it took me so long to realize that you also deserve to have your own life." His words were like a final balm for wounds that had already healed, but that I still remembered. "Ethan," I said, taking his hand, "the important thing isn't how long it took us to learn, but that we finally did. Now we have the opportunity to build a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine love, not on dependence or guilt." That night, after Ethan left, I sat on my porch under the stars and reflected on the entire journey I had lived, from the pain of feeling invisible and undervalued to the conscious decision to reclaim my autonomy, to building a new independent identity, to creating more authentic and balanced family relationships. The silence that had settled in my life wasn't an empty or resentful silence, but a silence full of peace and purpose. It was the silence of someone who had learned to value herself independently of external approval, who had built a life rich in personal meaning, and who had transformed pain into wisdom and invisibilization into empowerment. As I looked at the stars from my small South Side garden, I thought of all the women like Beatrice, like Rosario in Charleston, like the students in my future workshop, who were at some point on their own journey toward emotional independence. My experience had become something bigger than my personal story. It had become an example that it is never too late to rediscover who you are when you stop defining yourself solely by what you can do for others. The final reflection of that perfect night was a deep understanding that filled me with serenity. I had learned that true love, including family love, flourishes best when it is based on mutual respect and individual autonomy, not on dependence or sacrifice. Ethan and Tasha loved me more authentically now that they respected me as an independent person. And I loved them more freely now that I didn't need their approval to validate my existence. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give to those we love is to teach them to love us as we deserve to be loved, as complete, valuable, and independent people. And sometimes, the greatest act of self-love is giving ourselves permission to be exactly who we are, without apologies, without justifications, and without the constant need to prove our worth through service to others. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.